I like the
But
moody black and white.
well, the light's really terrible in here, and I thought that would at least make sense, the ambiance.
I like it. I mean, I kind of feel like, you're an informant in a 1950s mob movie or something, and you're going to sit here and squeal on the boss or something.
Oh, I'm gonna squeal like a pig. And I also turn on the black and white filter when I enter a classroom. So, you know,
That's for the
I'm
best. I would do
very,
the same thing.
yeah, I have a very hard-boiled style.
I like it. I like it. I always
Oh.
respected that about you. Well, we had you on the channel years ago. It was a very popular interview, actually, both for Patreon and then after it got put on YouTube later. Um, you're hoping this time, as you said, to talk about basically the early Indo-Iranian polity or lack thereof. Is that a fair way of characterizing it? I'm interested in what you can say about that and whether it might speak to characteristics of whatever we could say about characteristics of early Proto-Indo-European speaking society, if there is something you think can be inferred about that. And of
Hmm.
course, if you would take questions about Indo-Iranian matters from other people present, love to have you address that as well. Maybe you could start off by giving us a background about your own studies about this question and maybe defining some terms as we go.
Sure. Well, as you might recall from 2000 COVID, I don't know.
Yeah.
Um, I wrote my dissertation mainly on poetic impersonation. So it's very different than sort of interrogating the political imagination of early Indic peoples. But the more I worked on it, the more I sort of fell into this kind of obsession with thinking about, you invoke the idea of a lack of polity. And I'm not sure if I would quite frame it that way, but I
Okay.
think it would be fair to say a lack of something like a state.
Okay. Okay.
And I think we could argue that there was an Indo-Iranian polity, but an Indo-Iranian state, I'm not so sure. And I think the reason that is because of the way I see states is states do not perceive their own mortality.
Hmm.
I think that's a strange and opaque way of talking about it, but the idea of a state to some extent is that it continues beyond the people that are a part of it. And if we look at, certainly post-Westphalian statehood, there's this notion that subjects really belong to a state. The
Uh-huh.
state is the proto-corporation. The state is the angel that owns us and like a vampire lives forever. Now I've come across as very negative on the state, but there could be good vampires. All I'm saying is that states generally don't anticipate their own destruction.
Okay. Yeah. So a polity is perhaps more consciously self-organized, if I may attempt to paraphrase you, and consists of the
Yeah,
people living within it. Whereas with a state, we have offices that might be temporarily inhabited by particular people, but we anticipate that someone will always inhabit it. There will always be a president. There will always be a senator from Colorado or whatever, right?
that's right. And we can talk about the state having things like collective debts because the state
Uh-huh.
will be around to pay
Uh-huh.
them off,
Right,
right?
right, right, right. Okay, I see that.
Whereas if you and I were to form a club or an association, we wouldn't necessarily want to transfer all of our possessions into that trust.
Right.
Precisely because the minute we sour on each other, as I'm sure working closely together, we would find each other intolerable eventually. Like I
That's what
can't believe
happens.
you don't use thick plastic glasses and you're using the metal frame glass. I'll never get along with you, I can tell.
Right.
So, for whatever reason, an association that's formed between politically conscious people only lasts as long as those people continue to want to be a part of that association.
Mhm.
And I think when we talk about states, there's a level of abstraction where this we just like big floating abstract concepts like the economy, the state, things like this, even when we have trouble defining them, much like gods, we assume that they'll stick around.
Hmm.
Um, and in a sense, they're bigger than us.
Yeah,
Whereas, yeah,
and
go
I
ahead.
also see, like, I'm just trying to paraphrase this back to you to make sure that I'm following your thought.
Mm.
I also see a distinction that you're making probably between that polity, that stateless polity, and the tribe or family, because this is still something bigger than that, right? Family might come and go and recombine with different families. So we're not talking about just an extended family. We are talking about people coming together that aren't necessarily related to each other, right?
That's right. And I think it's important because we often don't recognize this, but a clan is very much like that. A
Hmm.
clan is often seen as a biological unit, like an extended family, but it's really a political unit because
Yeah.
it has all the retainers that belong to that clan, all the
Right,
people that have
right,
sworn fealty to that clan. And usually it's several biological units that have relations between each other, which could be marriage relations, but they might not be, right? So there's a very
right.
much a consensus that's built about what a clan is around a sort of lineage that dips into biology, but also out of it and into the workings of politics and public memory and things like that. So, when we talk about tribes, the term tribe is usually used to refer to this in the Vedic context, the alliance of the clans. We talk about a Vedic tribe, a Vedic coalition, and things like that. And I favor the term coalition.
Hmm.
Um, the word tribe is one that I've been rethinking lately after reading James Scott's Against the Grain, where he argues that the notion of a tribe is always something that's seen as exterior to a sedentary agrarian population, right? It's never
Right, right,
like
right, right. I see
used
what you
as sort
mean.
of the term of self-reflection. It's these are the guys that are outside of you know,
Right,
our settled space.
right.
So I'm
I
not
mean,
sure if I want to use that term, but I think coalition remains clean for me,
okay.
precisely because coalition captures the fact that, there's an internal diversity into a pragmatic grouping.
Hmm. And it strikes me that Plains American Indians very often operated in coalitions like that. You find Arapaho Cheyenne coalitions where people are not related to one another, but there's still sort of a polity there. Uh, that strikes me as something, and now I'm consciously not using the word tribe. Um,
Yeah.
the word the word tribe, I think you're right, is typically a term applied by outsiders. Although in the last 10 years, maybe I feel like there's a little bit more positive insider use of it that
Mm.
I hear people use, like especially of online communities.
Mm.
So I
Yeah.
guess that word's valence may be changing a little bit, but I understand what you're saying about it being a term mostly used by outsiders.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen colloquial positive uses like this is our tribe, right? This
Yeah, yeah,
notion of
that's what I'm
just
talking about. Yeah,
solidarity of people. But
yeah,
also there's still the stigmatization of terms like this is tribalism, right?
sure,
Uh,
sure, sure, sure. Yeah, yeah.
so So it's tricky. A lot of my thinking on this was influenced actually by the Christopher Boehm's 1983 Blood Revenge, where he looked at Montenegrin tribes,
Hmm.
and essentially they're dispersed clans. They live in what we might think of as anarchy, in the sense that there's no central power. In the 1800s, I mean, because certainly there was while Montenegro was part of Yugoslavia. But in the early 1800s, all these tribes essentially existed, and they always were on the verge of feuding with one another.
Hmm.
That is, the reason you didn't trespass on this or that tribe wasn't because of some law that said it was illegal. You weren't trespassing against a king by damaging one of his subjects. It was because horrible consequences awaited you should you dishonor this clan. And
Right,
there were many ways of dishonoring a clan: stealing a cow, killing a person, killing a dog on the clan's ancestral grounds, but not off the grounds where the dog clearly didn't belong, um, deflowering one of the women. There's all sorts of ways that you could blacken someone's cheek was usually the term used.
hmm.
And so what Boehm argues is that we think of blood revenge as this particularly like salacious and exciting and theatrical thing, like the Hatfields and the McCoys. But for
Right.
him, it was actually a tool of violence détente, because
Uh,
an honorable clan was known to defend its honor. And if you did not defend your honor and became known as someone who wouldn't defend yourself, then people were going to walk all over you.
right.
But in certain times, and those times were always an incursion from the Ottoman Empire, these people that traditionally despised each other, or at least were trying to out honor, out reputation each other, right? It's sort of a zero-sum game, could coalesce into a coalition and work to repel an Ottoman incursion.
Mhm.
And then when it was over, they would go back to their sort of anarchical state.
This is also
Uh,
very familiar from Icelandic sagas, for example.
yeah, I thought it might be.
Mhm.
Um, and so it's a nice way of, whenever I sort of talk about this to students, they become shocked that I'm so interested in blood revenge, um, because it seems so violent and terrible and things like that. But the actual incidences of blood killing and a feud that perpetuated across multiple generations was very, very rare. It was really the threat of it and stories about it that were part of a system of keeping violence to a minimum.
Right. Not so much mutually assured destruction in the same way that you're just going to annihilate the other clan, but mutually assured, I'll cut you. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the case of the Hatfield McCoys is actually a good one, because twice they almost sort of buried the hatchet, but then other factors intervened. It all began over the theft of a hog. It was initially almost solved with the marriage of the families together, but then I think that young lad was traipsing about, as you might imagine, and so that marriage was called off, and then they sought a local judge to be an arbiter, but then they ultimately rejected his authority to work out, who was at fault, because he was distantly related to one of them, the
Oh,
Hatfields or
yeah.
McCoys. I
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
know. So, these kinds of things make a particularly interesting story, but they're certainly not the norm. Usually a slight of honor occurs, and before things spiral out of control, some sort of arbitration is met. This is, of course, the famous scene, uh, and you're familiar with the Shield of Achilles scene, right?
Mhm.
They talk about how there's two men arguing over a blood price, and the wise men sit on stone circles, and whoever can come up with the best judgment will get 2 talents of gold. So presumably we have people caught in the middle of a violent blood feud. Um, and whoever can come up with the best compromise will be rewarded monetarily.
Mhm.
Um,
So there's actually an incentive and not so that
yeah.
there's not necessarily and I'm wondering if we can get to some of the particulars in Vedic society here. There's an incentive to be that arbitrator, but there's not necessarily a professional arbitration role.
Yeah. That's exactly right, I think. Now, in the case of the Montenegrins, usually they turned to a bishop in the Orthodox Church. And it seems like there were sort of bishops that were official and above this sort of thing. And then there were sort of lower level clergy who actually often participated in blood feuds, called the Pope or just the fathers. And for arbitration, I think they usually tried to find one of the more respectable fellows.
Mhm.
But sometimes the arbitration was rejected. Um, this is kind of why probably my favorite Greek plays, before we leave Greece forever, are Aeschylus's Oresteia, right? Because
Sure.
it exposes the core logic of this system. Orestes is duty bound, in fact, commanded by Apollo to slay he who has slain his father. Unfortunately, it's not a he, it's a she, it's his mom. So he's in a double bind. The only way to fulfill the needs of patriarchy and honor is to kill his mom, which also makes him a kinslayer. And the Furies pursue him all the way to Athens until Athena convenes the Areopagus, and they try and vote. Did he do the right thing or not? And they're 50-50. So Athena has to cast the tie-breaking vote and says, well, I was born from the mind of Zeus. I have no mom. So I'm going to side with Orestes. And and then she says, but you Furies, I like what you're doing here. I like it. It's just, instead of pursuing vengeance of the clans back and forth, why not pursue those that trespass against me,
Hmm.
Athena, and my laws in the city of Athens? So we have this play where Orestes is telling us essentially where the vicious, furious power of laws comes from. It was once this dispersed case of revenge, and now is divinized in the forms of the Eumenides, the kindly ones, who now carry out the laws of Athena. So excellent play, set of plays. Actually, the middle play, The Libation Bearers, has a really good version performance on YouTube. I think it shouldn't be too hard to find, but
I'll
really,
also give a plug for anybody who's interested in this. Was also rewritten by Robinson Jeffers in the 1920s as The Tower Beyond Tragedy.
oh, it's a good talent. That's a good title.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
So tell us a little bit about how this might work in Vedic society in particular.
Well, let me start by telling you this sort of, I mean, you're never supposed to like tell people your thought process. You just want
Oh,
just the
no, I'm
facts.
interested in your thought process.
But my thought process started this way. It started back in my dissertation when I was looking at a couple really interesting poems, and I was interested in impersonation. Both of these poems have Indra as the major speaker, and that was what my dissertation was about. But Indra, despite his reputation from the later period as kind of a drunken idiot, he's really astute politically in these texts. And so I want to share them with you.
Okay.
And this will sort of get me started on what sort of started my process. Am I allowed to share? Can I share?
You're co-host, so you should be able to.
Okay. All right. Let me find the files and we will. Is this what I want? I think this is what I want. I'm going to have to zoom in to make this good. Is this the one? Nope, not this one. Not this one. We'll start here. So this is Rig Veda 1165, maybe one of my favorite poems. I've written so much about this, and I'm going to do my best not to just talk about it forever. But
I think this audience will bear you talking about it as long as you want. But...
well, I've basically like returned to it in like 3 publications and said like more and more things about it. This is really probably, if not my favorite poem, certainly the poem that has the most influence on me.
Okay.
I've decided to use Jamieson and Brereton's translations instead of mine because I want to avoid the accusation that I'm reading through my translations. Let me just make a methodological point here, which is that there's sort of a hermeneutic circle, right? When
Yeah,
I translate, sorry, go ahead.
I like your translations. I think you're a good translator. But okay.
Well, I've translated some other places, and I have a slide deck prepared, by the way.
Okay. All right.
So I've decided to use these here because I'm going to point out places where I would translate things differently, for one.
Okay. Okay.
But in short, this is available to anyone that wants to foot the bill for the $300 hard copy, or should you, it's came out in 2014, so not hard to find if you know where to Google. Maybe some sort of anonymous account might post an appropriate link. Actually, I think it's on academia.edu. Nobody polices this shit. So anyway,
no UCLA coalition that's going to come and steal your calf if you steal their publication.
Well, this is Oxford University Press, so they're very far. They don't know what we're doing on this side of the pond. Anyway, the basic story is this, and what first attracted me to this is actually, I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Lars Lundroth. But what first attracted to me was that this was a perfect case of what Lundroth called the double scene. What he was talking about was that at the beginning of the Poetic Edda, right, there's a conversation between the Volva in the Voluspa and Odin. Now, what it occurred to me that, and I think maybe Thornvald wrote about this, that in that scene, it's also a conversation between the performer of the text and his very human audience, right? So there's this merging of these two scenes where the audience is now complex rhetorically. There are human beings who are listening. There's a human being who's speaking, but he's also pretending, he's impersonating this seeress, and presumably amongst ye greater and lesser sons of Heimdall, boom, is also Valfather. So this is in many ways very similar. Indra has arrived at a sacrifice, and these texts would have been exclusively performed at a sacrifice, very likely. Actually, there is a later text called the Rig Vedana that suggests there are other places where you might recite these for various effects. But probably at the time of its composition, it would have been used to create a scene about a sacrifice at a sacrifice. So this drew my attention for impersonation purposes. Indra shows up at a sacrifice and he says, "Oh, who's here but the Maruts?" Now, the Maruts are some 180 odd, beautiful young men, often called the like atmospheric spirits or spirits of the storm. Indra in the Rig Veda is often framed as their head, but we can see from this exchange he clearly is not initially.
Mhm.
Do the Maruts have a head? Do they have a leader, or are they, a gang of hardy and battle-ready youths with no leader at all? Um, I have a couple suggestions here. I think probably they maybe had a leader like Vayu, the god of wind, or Rudra, who would become, of course, Shiva in the later period. But Indra's really good in the Rig Vedic text at arrogating to himself all sorts of titles and legendary deeds. And when he can't, he sort of exposes how he was ultimately the one who helped this thing happen, blah, blah, blah. So Indra shows up and the Maruts are here and they say, "Oh, why are you traveling alone, Indra? We're actually here to take all the great things from this sacrifice, not you." And Indra says, "Well, if you listen, the texts are actually addressed to me. The formulations, the thoughts, the press soma are good fortune for me. Oh, I don't like this. My explosive power rises." Actually, it's shushma, which is really like it's the noise a horse makes or a bull makes. It's its snort. So really, it should be something like my whoop uh, rises. The pressing stone is brought forth to me. So he says, "Look, they're calling out to me, Indra. They're going to bring me all these things. They're going to present me with soma, this sort of accelerating drink, about which I'm happy to talk about it some. I should really put together another slide deck for that because it's one of my most common questions. But anyway, he's like, they're addressed to me. And the Maruts say to him, so what? Look at us yoking our chariots with these horses, and also we've got antelopes for extra power. Now you've experienced our independent will." Um, in an article I wrote way back in 2015, I argued that there was a close correlation between this svadha, or self-place, by the way, cognate with ethos. So self-determination was exactly cognate, or not cognate, but it was often paired with svakshatra, having self-command, and this is what made their bodies beautiful. So the Maruts are beautiful because of their willful independence.
Hmm.
Now, so they say, "Look how powerful we are, Indra. What are you going to do about it? We're here to take the fruits of this sacrifice. We're here to take the praise. We're here to take the soma. We're here to take the burnt offerings. We're here to feast." And Indra says, "Where was this svadha of yours, Maruts, when you tasked me alone to smash the serpent?" Now, this is a reference to when Indra destroys Vrtra. But here, "you tasked me alone" is an insufficient translation. Because really, and let me find my annotator, really what we're getting here is you adatta. You all some plus da. Now, da is the root that means to place. Some means together. So you placed me together. You assembled me, as it were, to destroy this serpent. Well, what you need to know here, this would be the finite verbal form, and this is just the preverb plus the root. What you need to know here is this is really the polar opposite of this noun, svadha, which is self-place. So where was your political independence? Where was your self-placement when you together placed me to do this thing? In other words, what I read out of this is that there's a tension in the Vedic texts. The Maruts aren't wrong to prize their freedom and independence, their autonomy. But at the same time, Indra's not wrong in saying that some sort of coming together or coalition with him at the top was necessary to achieve their aims. In other words, political coalition is fraught. It's dangerous, but it's necessary.
Uh-huh.
Let me just see if there's anything. I mean, that's the main point I think I wanted to get at. The Maruts essentially immediately recognize that this is right, and they start to praise Indra. And this makes Indra very happy. And he says, "You know what? You make me glad. You have praised me, and you will praise me, and you'll receive fame and drinks now, presumably at the sacrifice, as my irreproachable warrior band." Now, here's what's interesting. The Maruts are always in the plural, but there's no word for warrior band here. He says, "You'll just get this stuff as my irreproachable singular noun." So So in other words, only as a unified group are you irreproachable and will you receive the benefits of this union. And now this is another thing, is reflecting me here. In other words, what they mean is acting like me, imitating me. You Maruts need to be like me, Indra. And if you do that, and we all are working together in the same way, then you'll receive the benefits of my company. The
Does
stress, of course, has been that Indra's all alone up until now. Yes.
does that reflecting and line or verse 12, reflecting and receiving, are those present participles in the Vedic texts, and are they singular or plural there? At this point, is he talking to them as this unit, or is he still?
They're plural here.
Those are plural.
And then
Okay.
it suddenly becomes singular in its final moment.
Interesting.
Now, the reflecting me part is interesting too. As one of the few positive comments I got from my Doktorvater on my dissertation, where he said "nice," which was where's my
Those things live with you forever.
yeah. What it says here is prati ma, and I'm going to use capital A for long A, so I don't have
Okay.
to go root around for a rochamana. Now, this, if I reverse Sandhi, should have had a visarga here and marked the nominative plural. But in other words, ruch means to shine. So shining back, aka reflecting me, towards me. And this really, what this means is pleasing me on one level. But what's also interesting here is pratima is a noun in later Sanskrit, although it never appears it only appears in one other place in the Rig Veda. But pratima means a copy. Prama means a model. So even with essentially what we have is a case of tmesis, where the preverb has been separated from the participle, so that the enclitic personal pronoun me can be inserted in between them, but in such a strategic way to also invoke by sort of an embryonic double meaning here, that you're reflecting me, parentheses, as copies of me. Now, what we want to understand here is that the Maruts and Indra, the Maruts are not just, random spatial aerial spirits. They really are a euphemism for the young men of the clans, of the Vedic clans. And so there's a tacit message here that really the young men of the clans should be doing this too. They should be acting like Indra. They should be Indras themselves. They should act in that manly, great way that Indra does. I may have skipped over this great passage where Indra argues, look, it wasn't just because you appointed me, but actually I beat all my rivals. So there's a strong braggadocio element here. In fact, the first commentarial tradition calls this a poem of braggadocio. But what's key here is this is tacitly, if we think of that double scene, not just a message to the Maruts, it's a message to all the young men assembled there, that they should be like Maruts and praise Indra, but also Maruts should be like Indra. So there's the Maruts are just the intermediate models for how to be a man. And the way to be a man is to be Indra-like. Now, this only really gets interesting again down here. I mean, not to me, it gets interesting the whole way through, but for our purposes, we now find out why one might invoke this poem. That is, the mask, the invisible mask of Indra impersonation drops off, and the human narrator speaks and says, "Hey, Maruts, this is this praise song. Remember when Indra spoke it the first time," in essence. And through this, we would beg what is asterisk reconciliation. It has to do with an emendation that Oldenburg made, where what was understood to be what's written as vayam, he believed was actually a vayam with a sandhi loss of an initial which would mean something like a going down or a detente of hostilities. This is a poem about reducing hostilities. We have this altercation. Indra, the leader, Maruts, presumably the potential subordinates. They're hostile others, but Indra persuades them to join him. What could be a dangerous altercation just through no real act of violence, although Indra occasionally intimates that he could. Merely through the power of his poetry, Indra persuades them that it's actually for the best for them to be a coalition and a hierarchical one, with him at the top and them as his loyal entourage. So we could imagine how this poem would sound to ancient Vedic peoples who maybe they exist in a coalition, they're not particularly happy with who's on top. Maybe they don't particularly, maybe they chafe at the leadership in this coalition. Well, a poem like this reminds them of the value, even though it's sometimes dangerous, the value of such a coalition, and a reconciliation is supposed to be remapped out of this poem. Now, that doesn't tell us too much about the actual political organization, but it shows us one of the key tensions that you see in the texts. Svadha is everywhere in the Rig Veda. It's a major preoccupation of theirs. And that's likely because these poems were used to make a coalition. And what do people worry about when they form a coalition? They worry that they might not be in a particularly favorable position in that coalition. You could imagine, you know, the Constitutional Congress, right? Where you have smaller states and larger states, and they're getting together and they're trying to form some sort of federation. And they're wondering, you know, am I going to get the better or worse share of this? And they have to come to all kinds of compromises. Okay, let me look at another poem that was also in my dissertation. This one's tougher because it's a bunch of riddles. But the key point here is that Indra's sort of bragging about himself. And, well, really a human being is bragging about Indra for him. And I don't want to get into too many of the details. But after this act of praise, the singer praises Indra and says something to the effect of, wow, Indra, you're really like strong and powerful now. But, you know, can you answer a question for me? So this is what's key. Indra has been summoned not to necessarily defeat enemies, although he does brag about this. But here actually to answer some questions. And unfortunately for our singer, he answers those, he takes those questions and sends them back in sort of riddling form. So the singer says the cows dispersed, now it's the singer's fault because he's also asking riddling questions. The cows dispersed, ate the grain of the stranger. I saw them roaming with their cowherd. The cries of the stranger came together from all sides. How long will their own Lord find pleasure in them? Now, what's key here is this distinction between Ari and Svapati. This is the own Lord word. Their own master, their own boss.
Yeah, like the same word that's in despot, the one's own master. Yeah, I see.
Yeah, that's right. But with despot, the first part is the house word.
Is the house, right.
Right. This would just mean own master. And by the way, pati is also the word for husband in Sanskrit.
Interesting.
So Ari is what's being translated as stranger here. And this is a point, this is something I really actually disagree with. The reason we translate Ari as stranger has to do with Tima, who in the 30s, I think, it was back in the 30s, wrote that Ari represented the guest slash host. And sometimes because hospitality rights are full of tension about can we trust, right? Can we trust our guests? And I think that proliferates in Indo-European literature. I mean, think of the Odyssey, right? Odysseus is your most untrustworthy guest. At the same time, back at home, it's Penelope who's got to deal with her own untrustworthy guests. So Ari has been translated as guest slash host, and Brereton and Jamison and Brereton favor the translation of stranger. But I think it's really important to keep in mind the etymology of this word. That is, Ari really is no different than the ali that we get in, say, Latin alius. Okay. Ari really means other, but it's been, instead of being a pronoun, it's been substantivized into a figure. Likely what's missing here is that it's the Aripati or Ari Vishpati. I don't have a, I'll use Z for capital S. Vishpati. Yeah. That is the other clan master in our coalition. Thus, it's not really, the Ari is not an enemy. He's not outside our political organization, but he is an adversarial force within our political coalition. Right. You can think of him as the other party. The Ari is how Democrats and Republicans would think of each other, right? They would say that's the other guy, but they're still the intrusive other, not the extrusive other. Right. So what's key about this is, of course, this is the source of the word Arya that is often, associated with race, right? The Aryan race. But what we can see from this is really it's just the thing you do with the other clan. And what is that? It's form a political coalition,
Mhm.
right? So Arya, in my thinking, should have never really been understood as a term meaning a race at all. Rather, the it was the thing you did with another friendly but unallied clan. You formed a political coalition and therefore becomes a term of interiority. And because this was largely done by the like, the aristocratic leadership within clans, you could see how later on this would come to mean its Sanskrit value of noble or lofty or
Sure, sure.
noble in the English sense, but never like a race.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And that's perfectly understandable semantic development. I was trying to think. I feel like there's a parallel to this. It's just scratching in the back of my mind somewhere, and I can't quite get to it. But
Well, I mean, think about, Allemand, the Alemanni, right?
sure,
Maybe there's too many, none of it, one in, I don't know. But the
I
all
think
man,
it's the right amount of L's and N's.
yeah, the all man thing. What's an all
Yeah.
man thing? It's our political coalition, right?
Right.
So something that becomes a political coalition for different like tribes or clans of Germanic speakers
Yeah.
now is understood to mean a nation or a race. Les
Well,
Allemands, the Germans.
or even honestly, even Deutsch, right? From
Yeah.
Theodisk, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, keeping in mind where terms of ethnicity come from, I think they usually always, ethnicity just never goes back that far.
Yeah.
Eventually,
Yeah.
it's from people that saw themselves as fundamentally different, but had to make a pragmatic agreement.
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, American isn't a very foreign
oh, yeah.
category to this, really. So,
It's a perfect parallel,
yeah.
even though, some people might in their minds imagine Americans to look and seem a particular way. It's really, it's really a crazy quilt. And the Maruts are like that too, by the way. They're seen as the children of Pershni, who is the dappled mare. So, particularly a spotted and multicolored and variegated cow. And they're often described as having all kinds of different lights and colors and beauties, right? So they don't look they all are co-nested. They have the same origin and they have the same strength. If I were to go back to that, they have a lot of things in common, but they're also multiform in appearance, which is interesting. Um, so, what to do? We have this problem where what I'm arguing is that the cows, these are the people. Specifically here, they're the cows eat the grain. That's not what cows usually do. Usually the cows eat the hay.
Right.
And here they're framed as not like hay eaters, but grain eaters. There's some other hymns where we see a distinction between the hay eaters and the grain eaters. So I think that these cows there's a wink. These cows are really people. And they're following the gifts of someone of the other clan master. In other words, in our political coalition, our clan, our lord, is losing influence. And there's a shift as the clans are now favoring this new potential leader.
Hmm.
Okay. So we have a problem. Oop, I jumped ahead. Um, we have a problem then. That is the cries of the stranger come from all sides. How long will these cows isn't going to be, these cows are essentially their own Lord will not find pleasure in them. That is, he won't get to be in a position of supremacy over them. Well, Indra has this nice solution. When I will round up those that eat grass and grain of the people all together, I would have said hay. I like the word hay. When I will round up those people that eat the grass and grain of the peoples all together in a wide pasture, then a yoked animal will seek an unhitcher, while he who longs to, comma, will yoke an unyoked one. In other words, when Indra puts everyone in the same field, people that had been the yoked animals of another will get unyoked. They'll be untied. And then there's an opportunity to retie.
Mhm.
Now, here's what's interesting here. And I think this is what makes it very difficult. I sometimes say it's hard when you live within a post-Westphalian state to imagine life outside of a post-Westphalian state. And the reason is not just that it's hard to imagine what life without a state is. It's hard to imagine a situation where equality is not desirable or good.
Mhm.
Okay. So if you recall from, we live, the liberal subject says, hey, just because you're an aristocrat and you're highborn doesn't mean you're any better than me. I should be equally honored, and I will duel you for that honor. No, but we generally imagine, and scholars often project this on the past. They say, if these people knew better, or if they knew about the liberal subject, surely they would want equality. But I imagine that that's not true at all.
Hmm.
That there's a desire for hierarchy, but there's a difference because states are permanent. States imagine themselves to continue forever. There's a cruel edge to hierarchy because it means hierarchy continues forever. If you are in a vassal state, you're a vassal class of person. You're a second class citizen, as it were, right? The dangers of inequality in a modern state is we're not going to have a constitutional conference every 3 years and redecide how things ought to be.
Right.
In this case, Indra's telling us, well, look, I'm going to round everyone up in a pasture, and then we'll just see who's hitched and who will be unhitched and who will do the hitching. In other words, hierarchy is fine because any and all hierarchy is temporary, and any and all hierarchy is subject to renegotiation. What Indra's telling us is that's what the sacrifice is. The sacrifice is a moment of social mutability. You might be in a situation where this other clan master has all the power in our coalition, but he only has all the power until sacrifice time, when you have the opportunity to win people back over to you. How do you win people back over to you? We'll get to that in a second. But here's what's important. In a polity in which there's no permanent state, there seems to be a favoring of unequal hierarchies precisely because those unequal hierarchies only last until the next unequal hierarchy. Does that make sense?
It does, and it's what's particularly interesting to me about this ad hoc hierarchy and its temporary within a lifetime duration is how different it seems to me from later Indic politics too.
You're referring to the caste system.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's the main thrust of my work. I don't think it existed at all in the Rig Vedic period.
Mm.
And I think it essentially is a sort of invention of the post-Ashokan period.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not the first person to come up with that idea. As far as I know, Nathan McGovern in his 2018 book, The Snake and the Mongoose, was the first person to propose it, and it was a really influential book on me. But so since then I've been sort of looking for positive evidence of immutable birth determined social role, rank, etc. And I haven't found it. On the other hand, because I think these texts could never really conceive of such a system existing, you don't see a lot of antithetical evidence. You don't see a lot of places where a caste system is specific, like, oh, we don't do that, because why would they, right? I'm going to circle back to that in a second because it's where I want to go eventually, but it's less interesting at this point because we want to look at where all these cool ideas are coming from, I think. We want to know about the themes and the tensions before we look at that other stuff too closely. And I should say another influential book on me of late has been, have you ever heard of Pirate Enlightenment by David Graeber?
I've not.
It came out it came out posthumously because he died in 2020, 2020, I think. He died during COVID. But essentially, the argument is this. What he calls pirate enlightenment was that pirates of the Madagascar region were essentially a lot who, if you look at the documents that survive from these ships, often it's not like privateers at all. Pirates of this era usually took over a slave ship. They liberated the crew, I should say, liberated the slaves, and those slaves often joined the crew. And they had to come up with some sort of accord, almost like they were a union. They drafted documents where they stated clearly in advance what shares would go to whom, and then they elected a captain. And that's really interesting. This might not have been the case if they had not been stealing ships. When you steal a ship, it's hard to say who really owns the ship. So the ship was sort of communally owned. They elected a captain. And when they settled on the coasts of Madagascar and integrated with the Malagasy population, they found that they were in a bind. Because they were pirates and had a multi-ethnic, multicultural, contract-driven society, they were, there was a death penalty out there for any European power that they'd stolen from. if you're a pirate, you get the death sentence. And this makes it very hard to fence the goods that you're constantly stealing.
Mhm.
What they found was that they could craft these marvelous tales about exotic pirate kingdoms. And so they could talk about the Betsi Mizoraka kingdom, where there was a pirate king who ruled so and so and had this, and they did various rituals, like they would mix salt water and gunpowder and toast it to make binding rituals of these. I mean, it's very interesting, exciting stuff. But the point seems to be that, in a sense, these small polities weren't kingdoms at all. They were pretend. They were mock kingdoms, because when they pretended to be kingdoms of Africa, then Europeans were suddenly willing to trade with them and turn over food, gunpowder, and various other supplies in exchange for plunder, right? Had they just been pirates, they would have been, they would have been seen as public enemy number one. But once they had become kings, once they pretended they were kings, even though there's no evidence that they ever really had any sovereign power at all. When they could pretend to be mock kings, suddenly they were allowed to trade, and suddenly they were allowed to, make pirating a long-term functional profession. Now, this is interesting because if you think about today, what do people complain about when they complain about governments? They say, they're corrupt. They're not a real democracy. Oh, they pretend to be a democracy, but it's all fixed, right? Or, oh, sure, 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 they had an election, but have you noticed so and so's won every single time, right? So a lot of times when people try and discredit a government, they talk about how it's not a real democracy. The
Right.
flip side of that is, to participate in modern global geopolitical culture, you have to pretend to be a democracy at least. So maybe you are, maybe you aren't. But the point is, people are very skeptical and they're scrutinizing, is this a real democracy or not? Right? And we're going to criticize them by saying they're not. It would have been the exact opposite in the early Enlightenment and the age of pirates,
Got to
where
pretend to be a monarchy.
you have to pretend to be a monarchy. Something that was actually a functional democracy was very suspicious and crazy. But if you could
Right.
pretend to be a monarchy, then you were legitimate. And I think that's why this set off a light bulb in my mind, was because we do see lots of strong language of kingship in the Vedic texts. But when we look at how this kingship is described, we look at what actual powers these kings have, they had almost no power at all. In a way, it's like they were using the language of political sovereignty to prop up something that was anything but. The leaders of these coalitions were likely, you know, respected and powerful politicians, but I don't think the word king is really a suitable translation for Rajan.
Okay, I was about to say, what is the word? So Roger, but but when we think about states today pretending to be democracies, or these pirate coalitions pretending to be monarchies, there's another player at the table that they're trying to convince they're the same kind of player as.
That's right.
What is the narrative king here? Who's the other player that's being portrayed for the benefit of?
That's a good observation. And this is the one that I'm not entirely certain. I think
Okay.
that we usually think of Vedic peoples as somehow plopped into the Punjab and not connected with other, like as though they could endure in isolation. But I
Uh,
don't think that's the case at all. I think that, there's a long history of Near Eastern kingship,
sure.
sovereign kingship of the kind, very much of the kind where like the king is a god. Um,
Sure. Yeah. I mean,
I
that's
wonder if I wonder
same
if that's not
thing.
always the sort of imagined other.
Okay.
No,
Yeah.
really
They're
interesting.
thinking this is
Yeah,
putatively for if Hammurabi is hearing the Vedas.
right.
Okay.
Well, and I think in a sense, when someone does something really well, they get teased and mocked for it. Right?
Sure.
Someone's a hunter, they come back with a huge catch of fish, and they say, "Whoa, Mr. Fisher, like leave some for the rest of us," right? Even though they've done something really great, we have to take them down a notch or two. It's
Yeah.
almost like humans have an instinctive, like humor is a way that humans have developed to counteract someone occupying a place of supremacy for too long. We can tease them, but we'll still take their fish, as it were. So
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
wonder if that isn't part of the rhetorical motivation on some level, that we want to imagine that we have this leader, a king, but at the same time, we want to put a sharp upper limit on just how kingly that king is. I think of, let's compare the Vergobret of Alpine Gauls, right? So like Julius Caesar writes about these guys. They essentially they form a coalition among the Cisalpine Gaulish community, and they choose by ritual a Vergobret. And he supposedly has infinite power, but only within the strictly like demarcated boundaries of the territory. So he cannot, even though he's respected as the greatest leader, a holy man, whatever, he can't actually leave the territory during that period. Thus, he could not make any kind of aggressive or expansive war of any
Hmm.
kind. And the minute and he only has the office for 1 year. And when that year's over, so long as he lives, no one in his family can take that office.
Interesting.
But for that very brief period of time, that 1 year where he's the Vergobret, he's basically like, he's basically like what Julius Caesar wants to be, a Rex. And
Right.
he never gets it, but with sharply curtailed boundaries of where that Rex can roam.
Right. Or it strikes me that there's a very distant echo of something like this in the consul, the early conception of that office.
Mm. So we don't know who the Rigvedic peoples were seeing as their other. In the case of Cisalpine Gauls, likely it's the sedentary Roman Empire,
Right.
or the Roman Republic, I should say. In the case of our Vedic peoples, there were probably lots of sedentary populations around that they just didn't care to talk about directly,
Hmm.
right? I don't think they lived in a vacuum. And it's certainly the case that archaeological evidence suggests that even after the depopulation of many Indus Valley civilization centers, there's lots of evidence that those places, even though they shrunk and remained less industrious, were still large sedentary farming populations into the Vedic period. They didn't just magically vanish,
Uh-huh.
right? There's still people there that overlap with the Vedic peoples. The Vedic peoples just don't really care about them or talk about them very much. I think largely that has to do with the fact that only in certain times of the year were they likely to encounter them. Vedic peoples like to live in the high foothills and where there was expansive pasturage, um, where water, floods, and mountains made it very easy to defend oneself. You can just remember during the war with Afghanistan, how every summer there was a flood, and we were like, "Oh, it's disrupted U.S. peacekeeping operations." Every single summer there was chaos in those high mountains because all that snow melts, all these rivers go into spate, and it's an opportunity for shifting geopolitics. Not so in the winter when the Vedic peoples had to go down to find pasturage and forage, and they formed settled communities. I imagine that they knew well other settled communities down there, and that must have been their imagined other. Of course, I have to infer the existence of that based off of archaeological evidence that people lived in agrarian societies who are not Vedic. The Vedic texts don't actually talk about them.
Yeah. But then we also know there's people speaking a related language who are going as far west as to encounter Hittites and Akkadian speakers, right?
That's right.
Because we have
That's right.
evidence from so surely those people you have to imagine that their oral literature is something like the Vedas and they're settled.
Well, I mean, that's the tantalizing thing. They've never found the Mitanni capital, of course.
Right. If
Who
there is
knows what's in their royal archives? But the Mitanni also don't really have like, a social, if you look at their social structure, it's very clearly modeled after the Mitanni social structure is fourfold, but it's very different than any kind of like caste system or Varna system.
Mhm.
Essentially, you have a division between farmers. Okay, this is the classic Near Eastern division of the peasant farmers, and that's subdivided into peasants who own land, free farmers, and serfs who are tenant farmers, right? The other two divisions are artisans and the chariot warriors, the Marianu, but all of these cases, but the real division is that um, um, farmers of both types have to pay corvée labor as a tax, whereas the other type does not. They still pay military labor as a tax, but they don't pay corvée labor. And the reason for that is very simple. Their labor is more valuable because it serves the palace directly. So like, why would I make you dig an irrigation ditch when your hours of work are better served on chariot, or your hours of work are better served carving my elaborate bas-relief? Why would I take you away from this kind of specialized labor to like repair a dam?
Right.
So you can see, even though it's fourfold, like the caste system, the Varna system. It's totally different. And it doesn't share any of the same terms. So yes, we have to imagine that what we see in Vedic society is we could call the easternmost edge of an Indo-Iranian complex, but it might not even be the easternmost edge. There's no reason to think that there might not be Indic or something speakers in, within Indo-Iranian, but maybe not Indic speakers further to the east,
Right.
probably Indic, so there's a lot we don't know. These guys are peripatetic. They move seasonally. Their lives are so different than ours, except when I say ours, I mean people that aren't me. Actually, very similar to my life, in that teachers and students do live seasonal existences
Yes,
where they
true.
might do traveling during the summer and they live in one kind of mode of subsistence, and they have a very different mode of subsistence when in the winter, when school's in session.
Mhm.
Most human existence used to revolve around that seasonal clock. It's an artifact of the modern state that it doesn't.
Mhm.
Um, so I've dwelt on this forever. It's actually an incredible series of riddles that I am constantly pondering. Um, a lot of them are about the nature of time, which is always interesting. But we're not going to look into it anymore. We're going to instead look at some of this other stuff that I've been thinking about. Close you. Well, maybe I'll just minimize and
Let's
stuff.
let's take an intermission here since we're
Okay.
about an hour in.
Yeah.
And let's be back. Let's say it's 11:28 here. It's 33 minutes after the hour. Let's come back to this. Just give people a chance to get a drink of water or whatever.
Sure. I need some tea.
All right. Hey, while you're still muted, I'm going to throw a question in. I read a book by, I don't know actually how to pronounce her last name, Fernanda Piri. You familiar with her work?
Maybe if I saw the name. I'm not sure.
Pirie. She's an anthropologist of law. So,
Oh, that's
yeah,
interesting.
yeah, she had a book that was, got a lot of fanfare. I wound up reading a couple years ago called The Rule of Laws. Essentially, it was an anthropology of law
Hmm.
and its concept. So, her her field work is mostly in Eastern Tibet, but she also works diachronically across a variety of cultures and makes some interesting points about um, some of the emergence of the earliest law codes that we know, such as the Code of Hammurabi. And one of the really interesting points that I took away from her work was that when you read something in Hammurabi um, or in the Pentateuch about eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth,
Mm.
originally that's not about escalating violence. That's about containing violence, right?
Mm.
It's really originally about only an eye for an eye, right? Don't take both of his
Right.
eyes because he, right? Um, do you have any comments about that notion or about how that might relate to the
Well,
way?
that this is something I think that uh, I think Christopher Boehm talks about in Old Blood Revenge, which is that if you think about what revenge is, it's very much exactly like gift exchange. It's just a very
Uh,
bad gift,
uh,
right? So when you give a gift to somebody, um, it's incumbent you're the sort of noble giver of gifts, and they are sort of obligated to you until they give you something not equal, but a little bit better,
uh,
right? So gift giving is always about one-upping each other to put the other person in the subordinate position. It's not just like we're friends. Remember, if I go and buy something from you, I give you exactly $5 for something that costs $5, our transaction's complete
right.
and I can go off my way. We're strangers now. But if I give, if you give me something, then I'm like, well, I'm really in this person's debt. They did me a real solid. So it's not just enough to do something quantifiably equal. I want to do something even a little bit better to show you that I appreciate it, but also maybe to restore my standing and put you in there's a great story. I think maybe you'll
Oh,
know it, but
there's Norse stories very much
yeah.
along those lines too.
What's the story about the guy who's like, oh, look at this amazing shield. I'm going to give it to my liege lord, and he'll have to sing songs about me forever. And then the liege lord
Yeah.
finds out he's on his way. Is it Eagle or something?
No, it's
And he's like, kill that
Alvin.
guy. I don't want to get that gift. I don't want to sing about him forever.
No, I think that's the story of Alvin and the bear. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I know what you're talking about because he he has a polar bear and he's like, "What will you give me for this polar bear?" And then the king of Norway says, "Well, I'll give you all this stuff." And he's like, "Okay, hold on." And he goes to Denmark and he says, "The king of Denmark, like, what will you give me for this polar bear?" It's like, "Well, I'll
Ah.
give you this." And he says, "Well, the king of Norway will give me that." Like that's the story that comes to mind there. Or I think actually, in my Norse myth class, we've been reading just with a fine tooth comb through all the stanzas of the Poetic Edda, and we just recently read the stanza in Havamal about there's tons of stanzas in Havamal about reciprocal gift giving, right? But one
Mhm.
that's always stood out to me is that there's this line, "Sutir ag lugar vid gjovum," which is the ungenerous man mourns, and the verb mourns is like how you would like wail at the death of a friend about
Mm.
gifts, right? It's
Hmm.
because he doesn't want to have to like give back. Uh,
Yeah.
and yeah, that was the first thing that came to mind when you mentioned that revenge in a sense is
Yeah.
negative gift giving because you're right. Like the temptation to assert status is not to give you $5 for a $5 gift. It's to give you $6 for a $5
Yeah.
gift.
Yeah.
So that
Exactly.
yeah,
And again, this plays into the idea that we're not giving gifts because we're equals. We're
right,
actually always jockeying to
right,
be superior, to be unequal. But it will only last until the next presentation of gifts.
right, right.
And I
And
think revenge works that way too. Just like you want to give a gift that's a little better to get out from under that debt, when you owe a blood debt, you want to get them back a little bit extra.
yeah, yeah,
And the danger here is the smallest, so maybe, ideally, if you killed my brother, I don't have a brother, but do you have a brother? I don't think you do.
I do. I do.
You do. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Well, I'll have to kill him now. So if I kill your brother and you're like, I can't kill his brother. I gotta get him back. And then you kill my father. And I say,
Right.
whoa, a father is more important than a brother when it comes, so you've done a little bit more. And now, we're not evensies. We have a vendetta. And
Right.
I've got to find some way of doing that and a little bit more
Right. And then
until
you
we
say,
find
well,
some sort of,
he doesn't have any more brothers, so I'm going to kill all his
yeah,
cousins.
yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right.
One of the great Montenegrin revenge plots that we have from the 1800s, because it was written down in an arbitration document, was um, a man seduces a girl and impregnates her. So of course, this already would have been like, you must marry my daughter, blah blah blah.
Oh,
But the father goes and says like, you must marry my daughter, and he says, it wasn't me who did it. Everyone knows your daughter slept with everyone in town. And so the guy, infuriated, having his cheek blackened, then immediately kills the boy.
oh,
So now he's in a bind because he now owes a blood debt to the family. At the same time that he wants to get some father to be there for his daughter,
oh,
right? Because he doesn't want to support her himself. So it almost explodes into additional violence, but the arbiter comes up with this eloquent solution, which he says, look, if the girl has a boy, that boy replaces the dead son.
hmm.
And he'll enter your clan and she'll be supported as his mother. If the girl gives birth to a daughter, then you only have to provide this small like stipend annually for her support.
Oh,
Because this staved off violence and also dangled the possibility of having a grandson to replace a son, they found this reasonable.
I mean, I, from a pre-modern perspective, I understand it. I mean, you see something similar actually in something else I've read with Old Norse students recently, Sona Torek, where Egil is mourning a son, and he says, "Well, the only thing that can replace a son is a son, right?"
Yeah.
And
Yeah, and so I think that in a way, blood revenge is nothing other than gift exchange, but where unfortunately there's an upper limit to the gift,
yeah,
right? I could give you more and more treasures, but actually there's no treasure that's as valuable as your kin.
yeah,
That person means more to you than anything. And so it's an economy that, unlike gift exchange, which is sustainable, blood revenge either has to be quashed or it will spiral out of control because you're never going to just accept the loss of a kin and then get like presents for it. In one case in Montenegro, not only did they essentially have to get to a point where, however briefly, the deaths were equal on both sides, then they had to go and do a big celebration with the family they hated and present to each other the guns they had used to kill the other members' families so that those could be destroyed.
wow,
And that was the surrogate destruction so that they could, return not to a state of friendship, but at least in, détente,
right,
ceasefire.
right. Well, that's an impressive symbolic gesture, which I suppose that kind of impressive symbolic gesture is exactly what underlies the creation of polities too. The kind of rituals you're talking about where polities are renegotiated and people's relationships are renegotiated.
I mean, this stuff is, I teach a class called, I've taught a class. I don't know if they'll let me teach it again, but it's called Religion and Reciprocity. And so you do
This is
gift
at
exchange.
Georgia College.
This is at Georgia College and State University.
Hmm.
It's a sophomore seminar. So, a lot of people that have no idea what they're getting into. But, it starts with gift exchange and then we move to revenge.
Hmm.
And that's spicy. And then after that, I think the unit after that is on prayers and pledges, right? To what
Okay.
extent is a prayer a kind of pledge you make?
Hmm.
And to what extent can you expect the divine to honor that pledge or reciprocate, right? To what
Hmm.
extent is a promise kind of a gift too?
Sure.
Where does it end? I think it ends on like fiat currency and speculation about debt. I think it gets modern and crazy because, you teach a course all semester and at the end you really want to just start like hitting them with your dream journal, as it were.
Yeah.
So,
I know how it goes. Yeah.
yeah. So, we this is one of the places I really break with the guy who's thought of as like the master of the Vedic sacrifice, which is uh his name's on the tip of my tongue. Broken World of Sacrifice by Hestemon. So Hestemon saw the sacrifice as essentially an act of violence,
Hmm.
as the execution of the sacrificial animal and therefore of the king, and then assembling the altar and singing the songs, in a sense, put Humpty Dumpty back together. It reassembles the sacrificed um, cosmic primordial giant, taps into its energies, but that it's laden with the poetry and rhetoric of warfare and battle because it really was understood to be a battle, and previously in times of antagonism had been the sites of real battles where you, in order to disrupt your rival's sacrifice, might ride your chariots through it and like fuck shit up and then be like, see ya, and ride off.
Hmm.
And I think that, a lot of what he has to say is right, but I think he's over historicized the reality of sacrifice as a battle. That is, by the time you get to the sacrifice, all the real politicking behind the scenes is done.
Uh-huh.
Whatever the soft power of how we arrange our coalition is completed. That is not magically brought into being. That is something that's worked out, and then the sacrifice is an act of legitimating it. And so I don't think it was ever really like that, but it has to symbolically contain the struggle that it's actually declaring to be done. And in
Sure.
that sense, it's really kind of like more democratic than most institutions you would imagine. These are these enlightened pirates, like mock kingships. The clans get together and decide essentially whose turn it's going to be. I mean, who's got the political capital? Who's willing to win the most friends over through gifts? And who's going to come out on top and then have a sacrifice that elevates them to the status of terrestrial Indra. But how long do they get to be terrestrial Indra? This is the question. If you pay close attention to the Rig Veda, a few months.
Hmm.
If you pay close attention to the Black Yajurvedic texts, that system's been reorganized, but it's still for about a year.
Hmm.
And I don't think, although I think that there was a hereditary clan leadership, the Vishpati was an inherited position. It was aristocratic. Your father was the Vishpati, you were the Vishpati.
And there's that
Lord,
pati word again.
yeah, the
Yeah.
lord of the clan. But when we talk about being a Rajan, when we talk about being the ruler of a coalition that had to be renewed and recreated seasonally, your position there was highly tenuous.
Mm-hmm.
No one was a hereditary Rajan, in my view. This is a place where I disagree with Brereton. I think he believes that it's sort of a fictional election for hereditary kings, and that's possible. But I think the election really is more real than the rhetoric of kingship. In the same way that, like, we had two Bushes and we had two Adamses, right, for
Mm-hmm.
presidents. That's not because we have hereditary presidents, but sometimes it could be hereditary, but it's not notionally hereditary.
Well, people inherit, in a sense, they inherit candidacy, right? Because they
Yeah,
inherit the resources and the family connections, something like
I'm
that.
so I'm so glad you said it that way because I think that's going to be really crucial to where I want to go next. So first,
Okay.
what is this polity? Um, I will share. First of all, I have got a slide deck on some gods.
Is it
You
in
want to
black
talk
and
about
white?
gods? Huh?
Is it in black and white?
Yes, it's in black and white. You're just guessing all my things right now, aren't you?
I've actually enjoyed doing this in black and white.
Yeah, it's classy.
I feel like we're really classy here.
Yeah. I should roll my own cigarette. Say like,
Yeah, I need to get my like pork pie hat or something out.
yeah, yeah. Um, I want to, my this classy dame's going to come in a second with a sob story about two kids. Uh, but all right. So the bodies of the gods. Why is this cool and important? In 2007, Preferis wrote this. Through various versions of the Tanunaptra myth, the outline of the narrative is straightforward. Various separate groups of God, Deva, each with its own chief, the social organization, blah, 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 of a federation of clans, they submit themselves to the superior of another amongst them. As a result of their lack of solidarity, the Asuras threaten to overcome them, but they team up and they unite. Now, you didn't see this in Rig Veda 1165, which was the Marut Indra part. I should circle back around to this. But Indra says, I like what you're doing. You are allies for the ally.
Hmm.
You are with your bodies for the body. Now, this is something, this is the word tanu, body. In essence, what Proferus is arguing is that body has a double meaning. It's not just the physical body of a god, it's also the body politic. So a bunch of bodies represent the body politics of the clans, and their bodies are for the body of Indra as the political coalition of all of them together. So if the only way to beat our rivals, and we shouldn't necessarily think of the Asuras as some sort of non-Vedic civilization or indigenous or whatever, it's anybody outside of that coalition. Given that a coalition of clans could just be a few thousand people, there might have been tons of coalitions, each of them presenting themselves as the one true Indra coalition. So let's talk about a couple gods. First, I'll give you what Proferus noticed, and then I'm going to add some data of my own, my translations of my own. This dominion has been conferred. Varuna has generated his own body, Svatanu. We have become the commitment bound of this bright alliance. We have just mentally realized the great name of truth. So these are in the Black Yajurvedic Samhitas, specifically the Katha Samhita. And then in the commentarial literature, the Aitareya Brahmana, it says, they deposited together their bodies in King Varuna's house. Since they deposited together their bodies, Tanu, in King Varuna's house, this rite becomes the Tanu Naptra. Now, this is what it says in the Rig Veda.
What is Naptra?
Well, it's really, do you know I think it's probably from Napat, which is
nephew.
Yeah. So really like scion.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I was just checking.
Yeah. Actually, I haven't thought about it. Napat, Napatra, Tanu Naptra. Well, could potentially also be but I think it's that.
That's the only root that occurs to me with what would nep be, right? That's the only thing I can think of is that nephew nepotism root.
Yeah.
I don't think it's nose.
Yeah. I think that's essentially, I think that's probably what it is, the scion of the body.
Yeah. Okay. Just checking because it's clearly an important word here. So I wondered if there was some kind of, I'm not trying to derail you.
Yeah. No, I should check actually, because I've always just gone with the title, because a lot of rights have titles where it's not always clear if the title is significant to what you're working on. But people like to know the etymons. So and you won't see this term in the Rig Veda itself. Here's Rig Veda 786, where Vasishta says, "And I dialogue with my own body. When will I become inside Varuna?" Now, in the Jamison Brereton version of this, I should say that it says, "When will I basically speak by myself," is how they, with my own body is by myself in their translation. But I don't think that's how it should be translated. I think it's when I speak with my community. And they say, when will I be in Varuna's presence? But it's really the Antar Varune is not inside the presence of Varuna. They've gone and specified with this preverb. They really mean inside Varuna. In other words, Varuna.
This is Latin inter.
Intra. Yeah, exactly.
Intra,
yeah. So the question here is, if he's speaking to his body politic, he's on the outside of this social organization, and he's sadly bemoaning and asking, when can I be back in the club? Varuna is the name of that political alliance, just as it is the name of the god.
Okay, I see.
One who will be forgiving to the one having committed the trespass. May we be free of trespass in him, in Varuna. In other words, we may have done some shit to each other. We may have crossed each other. We may be feuding. But in Varuna, we are free of trespass. In this body politic, we are free of the history of crossing and double crossing each other. We are gracious and forgiving. Indra. This is Proferus. Indra is yonder sun. They, the gods, stood for the supremacy of him. Of him who knows this, his equal stands for supremacy. In him, they, the gods, deposited their bodies. Therefore, he burns most brilliantly. This is a pun on Indra and the root id, to burn. It's not a very good pun, actually, which is why. But probably they're saying that's why he's Indra, even though it's kind of like the equivalent of a near rhyme in English. Now these favorite bodies and proper institutes that the gods put down together, they then deposited in Indra. Indra indeed is this one that burns. He did not indeed burn in the beginning. As the others here was black, so was he. It is by the puissance deposited in him by the gods that he burns. So Indra is being said to be like the sun. Now, for Proferus, this is important because he thinks that there's two major metaphors at work in all Vedic poetry. One is fire and water, because water and fire have this in common. They can be separated and reunited.
Mhm.
Proferus understands that the Vedic peoples lived in a seasonal fusion-fission model. In the winter, they fused, and in the summer, they fissioned. They separated out and went their own way. I would go a step further. I think that most of the poetry about raiding and stealing cattle and things like that is summer poetry. In the
Uh-huh.
summer, you were able to crisscross, double cross each other. You were able to steal cattle. You were able to do all kinds of feuding things because they were separated by high mountains, difficult to pass rivers. It was an easier time to defend oneself. Whereas you don't see that in the winter poetry, generally associated not with Indra, but with Varna, when they have to live communally. I think it's also probably the case that their sense of private ownership or property that belonged to the clan collapsed in the winter and they shared resources communally. This
Mhm.
was probably how they essentially quashed the beef by giving up their resources to people they had maybe slighted and sort of ending the asymmetry of wealth. This is sort of interesting to think about in terms of modern capitalism. If you know Weber's article on modern capitalism from the beginning of the 20th century, he essentially says, well, capitalism must have begun when Calvinists were basically despised by their communities. And so they had no reason to reinvest any profits they made with their businesses in the people around them. So instead, they hoarded their wealth. They hoarded their wealth. And in pre-modern civilizations, wealth is really useless when hoarded. It has to be constantly given away and spent to renew and build social ties, which is the real money of the universe. Reputation, honor, friendship. These are things that you get by dispersing wealth. And so you
Right.
can think of, yeah,
It's the transaction that's the wealth and not the resource.
that's right.
Yeah.
It's the relationship that occurs because of these reciprocal relationships. So
Yeah.
one way we can think about this is that there's an alternation between Indra as the name of, we don't have to call it a tribal alliance or a coalition. We can call it an Indra. They formed an Indra in the summer, and they formed a Varna in the winter. And the
Hmm.
rules of interrelationship between clans seem to have differed. Um, Here's some nice Rigvedic lines. Let there be rich clans whose prizes are powerful in our festival. In Indra. He who through ceremonies places his gift relationships in Indra. However many attacks there are, they go across him, who will be by ritual act in Indra. Right? So there's collective defense, presumably, in our tribal alliance, even though it happens to be the Summer Alliance, which is more semi-autonomous clans and not really settled existence. And this is a line I really like, this last one, because it says essentially, both and just he is the king who rules over the folks. He's contained them like a rim around a nave.
Hmm.
This image of the wheel, I think, reflects a lot of Vedic poetic ideas about the year. The year is a wheel. I think that's not too hard to imagine. Um, Especially if you have seasonal alternations of existence. This is a claim kind of late in the Rig Veda. I think it's a claim that's saying Indra, despite what you may have heard about Indra being the god of summer, as it were, Indra rules all year long. So
Hmm.
this is the kind of protesting the idea that Indra rules over um, Indra is ruling over just the summertime. He contains them. To support that, I would have to fish out a couple verses about where they describe the year as a wheel with 360 pegs.
Huh.
Presumably, the remaining 5 pegs are intercalary.
Hmm.
Um,
Well,
there's 2 passages in the Rig Veda where we're told that the sacrifice takes 5 days, and
all
so
right.
I suspect that the sacrifice is seen as something that exists outside the year and sort of repairs and renews the year. So we have 360 days in a year, and then these special 5 intercalary days that bring about the new year.
Very interesting. That's also, I mean, Yule, as
Yeah.
everything we know about it, which isn't a lot, suggests that it's a festival of a few days around midwinter night, whatever exactly that is. Um, just a couple thoughts. One is, I mean, it's you paint a really fascinating picture here that's counterintuitive for modern people of a society that organizes itself differently seasonally. And I think that also really helps us understand how the message of early texts like this gets distorted as people become
Mm.
more and more oriented toward thinking, January is like July, right? I mean, in
Mhm.
our society, January and July laws are the same.
Yeah.
Um, it's sort of mind blowing to think, oh, well, there's actually, you could well live in a society where the laws are quite different. Laws, if that's even the right word, in January versus July, but it makes some sense for people who depend much more on the rhythms of nature. I also wanted to ask about this last line, which you said is maybe a little bit late. It's
Hmm.
got it's got that word kashayati, right? So that's a different word related to rulership. Is that used differently in earlier or do you see that word come up in earlier Vedic poetry? What are the valences of that vis-a-vis the role of these elected rulers? Do you ever see that used early on of what the
Yeah, I wouldn't say that Shayati stands out particularly as something that suggests more. I mean, there's a root ksha that means to master or dwell or rule, and this kshi root that you see in words like kshetra, kshetriya, um, and it's well attested in Iranian too.
right?
Um,
It's the normal word for king in Iranian, right?
yeah, but not, kshatriya actually, or kshatriya is attested in Avestan.
Okay.
Once. It's when the cow is complaining to Ahura Mazda that, she's vulnerable and she needs someone to be, basically she needs someone to be her kshatriya.
Interesting.
And Ahura Mazda sends down Zarathustra and she's like, this Joker, his voice is weak and he doesn't have any other cows, right? So she's just complaining and complaining. But the word doesn't appear otherwise. Other words with the
Interesting.
same fundamental root are developed. So maybe that's telling that kshatriya was not seen as a suitable word for king. The word for king in Iranian is similar but different. There's also a ksha root that means to dwell. That's probably related to the tekon, dgom, groom,
Okay.
zemelya,
Earth.
the ksham word
Yeah.
and so there's that. So the two may be related in
Interesting.
a
Okay.
sense. I mean, I don't mean to say they're related necessarily in an Indo-European sense. That's
Right, right,
unlikely.
right, right.
But I mean, there might be some poetic play on the two.
Hmm, hmm.
You could think of Shayati maybe as he domains over the folks. And
Okay.
another thing about Vedic political power is it's rarely thought of in terms of owning land. Rather, you hold land with the root dr to hold. Think of King Darius, right? Daraya
Hmm.
Vahu would in Sanskrit be Darayad Vasu, the one who takes hold of the wealth. So you hold things. Um, but also another way is that you are heard about, right? So you have vibhu, you have extension abroad. Your power is really your power outside of your immediate vicinity is due to word of mouth.
Hmm.
So there's a very aural aspect to this, to political power. Um,
Well,
I
and the
think,
social power in any society, right? I mean,
yeah,
I think of words in Old Norse, dom or orstir, that have
yeah.
very similar valences, yeah. And but usually not used in a political sense, but rather just of your social reputation, your standing. But of course, that means a lot in terms of pre-modern political organization too.
Yeah, I mean, in the great Purusha Sukta in the Rig Veda, where the giant is sacrificed, it's his ears, I believe, that become the directions. And people might think, oh, that's kind of surprising, an abstract idea like northeast, south, west, etc., from the ears. But of course, your knowledge of these directions is entirely based off of what you hear about them.
Yeah, yeah. I see, yeah. Oh,
Um,
that's I hadn't thought about it. That's cool.
well, and in terms of the Vedic peoples often call themselves the five folks.
Hmm.
And sometimes people try and argue there were five distinct tribes that they thought of themselves as constituting. But I want to say Schleiermacher had this great idea that really they thought of themselves as the people plus those to their northeast, south, and west. That is, whoever did the
Okay.
sacrifice becomes the sort of geopolitical and culturally aesthetic center. And then you have people that are to their around them,
Uh-huh.
their
Uh-huh.
periphery. They're not exactly marginalized, except in the most literal of senses. Um, And then if someone else were to take power to your east, that would be the new center, because there's never a time when you're going to go you're going to run out of people, right?
And also, whatever particular family unit or polity that you might be in, you never think you don't ever think of yourself as on the margin. It's
right. Yeah, exactly.
who's
You never think of
Northwest
yourself as the unimportant part of society.
right.
And Vedic models of society are often fivefold in this way. Okay, so this is something I wrote just about the seasonality of this stuff. I put it in here. I probably don't need it to, but it's important to note that what they seem to call summer is called yoga, because that's the time of hitching. When you hitch up and you're on the move, whereas kshema, also from this root kshi, to dwell, to rest, is the winter period, the period of communal habituation. Well, kshema could also mean peace. It also is used in Buddhist texts to refer to like patience and forbearance. So you could call it the patience period and the wanderlust period if you want. But it makes sense why relations of hostility would be easier when people are more spread out. You need those hospitality relations just to meet together, because once you're far enough away from each other, the consequences for wronging each other plummet. It becomes a greater undertaking to get payback. Whereas when you live together, when you're all at the same workplace and someone has clearly labeled their lunch and someone else eats it, right? Your options are to hide your identity, or because payback will be immediate.
Right.
And good old cosmic man, the Purusha Sukta. Often this is seen as the origin story for the four Varnas, the caste system. The Brahmana was his mouth, the Rajanya was fashioned from his arms, his thighs are the Vaishya, and from his feet the Shudra is born. I don't want to go too much into this caste aspect, but I do think that it's important to remember this is not a fourfold division, it's fivefold, because the Purusha is the guy that contains them all. He's the fifth person. And it's likely that this is a kind of denuded version of Varuna, God as body politic, Indra, God body as body politic. The Purusha's body is the body politic too. There it's paper thin, right? It's very transparent. And it's likely that this Purusha was also whoever happened to be patronizing the sacrifice. So again, instead of thinking necessarily of these four people as four social classes, what we really have is four relationship types. And I'll just leave it at that for now. Four different ways of, at the sacrificial event, at the festival, four different ways of relating to the patron, the guy who paid for all this, the financier, the soon-to-be pretender to the leader of the alliance. There's four ways of relating to him: being a Brahmana, a Rajanya, a Vaishya, or a Shudra. That means that these are probably not terms of self-identity or like categories that people even knew about. There's a couple great places in the Atharva Veda where this guy says like, oh, here's a poem. It's a classic sort of plant poem where you grab a plant, you are going to use it for some sort of alchemical effect, but you have to praise the plant too. And so when he praises the plant, he goes, this plant will allow me to see basically sight beyond sight. I can see who is Akim Eden, which is basically like who's how would I translate? Like basically like a shapeshifter. Who's a who's who's a whatever, Akim Eden. Who's a sorcerer? Who's a revengeancer, right? So they're using this special plant to gain supernatural sight to see who might be after them for revenge of the covert type. And what is witchcraft? That is, what is witchcraft but the suspicion that someone is going to get revenge on you that really can't? Why do we accuse women of witchcraft? Well, if I've wronged you and I know you're not in a position to actually get overt revenge on me, I might suspect you of covert revenge. And thus, I'm going to accuse you of witchcraft because on some deep down level, I really think you ought to be getting revenge against me. So everyone who's out there for covert revenge, I'm going to use this plant to perceive who's doing their machinations against me. And then it says, let me see the Arya and who's the Shudra. So presumably something that if was really a race or a social class or something that was immediately perceivable, why in the world would you need a magical plant that also allows you to see shape changers and sorcerers to see who's what? Rather,
Sure.
I suspect these are ritual categories that only existed on the ritual grounds, that were created on the ritual grounds, and most people didn't give a shit about.
Right.
And they
I
were
th
like, oh, I guess.
I think it's brilliant because I mean it's hard to think of a parallel today, but I mean like in on at any given moment today, you or I might be a buyer or a seller, but we're
Mhm.
not permanently buyers or sellers of things, right?
That's right.
So it seems to me that
Yeah.
it's like who is among today's buyers.
Yeah.
So a status of that kind that fluctuates from day to day and just has valence for a particular interaction or relationship is am I is that a stupid analogy?
No, it's not. It's not at all. It's certainly, these are, like we're talking about, these are hierarchies too, but they're temporary hierarchies. You won't
Yeah,
see a lot of evidence that says, oh, this person was, you'll never see evidence, by the way, in the Vedas that says this person was born a Shudra and they remained a Shudra and they died a Shudra. That's not the kind of thing you'll see. Instead, you'll see things like, um, you'll see sometimes sort of what am I platitudes about these various peoples, right? But you could easily sub out, and this is kind of like if I were to tell you, man, freshmen suck.
uh-huh.
Some people out there are freshmen and they suck. But that doesn't mean that you were born a freshman, and it doesn't mean you'll die a freshman, right? It
That's a
means
brilliant
that
analogy. Yeah,
the
yeah.
category of freshman, or I could say, I'm an assistant professor, but I hope one day to not be an assistant professor, to get promoted, right?
Oh,
So, to what extent is ritual promotion a part of this? The Vedas are pretty silent on it, but I think there's some indirect evidence that suggests that these are not permanent categories. They're ritual categories that most of the population, well, I mean, they're inventions of the priesthood, and most of the population is not the priesthood. So they would have been like, oh, apparently I'm a Shudra. Huh, who knew? Of course, this is just talking about the Vedic period. There will be a conceptual realignment and reinvention in a series of texts that are usually dated to the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE called the Dharma Sutras.
mhm.
Something is going on in those Dharma Sutras. But this is all a millennium before.
Well,
Um,
and it strikes me there's a parallel here if we think about the seasonal variations in the
mm,
year that govern
yeah,
how the polity works. There's also a certain seasonal variation in people's lives that might be reflected in promotion from one of these positions to another. I mean, just like if you can say kids are this way. Well, we've all been a kid, but no
yeah,
one's permanently a kid.
exactly.
Yeah.
And I also sometimes think about, have you ever heard of the Aro Confederacy?
No.
They were a West African confederacy that dealt with Europeans in slave trading and things like that. But one of the things they're known well for, and this directly impacts slavery, is that they had a sort of secret society with all these complicated ranks in it. And to usually to go up in the secret society involved a kind of distribution of gifts. Specifically, it became sort of regularized into a gift of brass rods. I want to say brass rods. The reason is most forms of what we think of as money, really proto money, were things that were used to beautify the human condition because all humans are equal, right? But wouldn't it be great if we were a little less equal? So if I'm a little more beautiful than you, well, sticks that can be used to make makeup, bolts of cloth, jewels, of course, precious ductile and malleable metals, right? All these
Hmm.
things that can be used to beautify the human form and make us more interesting in their sort of post-extracted but pre-crafted form become useful measures of wealth, and they're on their way to becoming coinage and money and things like that. So these brass rods seem to have been something like that. It must have maybe in the past been some sort of gift distribution, but now it had become regularized. Well, it was extreme. Every rank you go up took like exponentially more brass rods.
Huh.
And so you're in a position where sometimes in the social merit of being at a higher rank and the opportunities it afforded you meant that it was worth going into intense debt to get those brass rods.
Huh.
And so maybe you took some risks you shouldn't have taken. I don't want to get too much into it because I only know a little bit about it and it's not my field. But I do think that probably if we think of early Varna as a kind of ritual ranking system in some sort of secret society, the Vedic society, in the old sense of the word society, like, you know, um, uh, the the American Oriental Society, right? Where it's an association of people. If we think about that, think about it in that way, perhaps rising in the rank took progressively and exponentially more generosity
Mhm.
towards the
Mhm.
priesthood. So that's something to think about. I'll just pass briefly over Vach because I don't think she was usually thought of as the body of the body politic. Um, but there are a couple interesting lines here. Wherever visionaries create Vach means voice. It's vox, but it's also the goddess of poetry and voice.
Mhm.
Wherever visionaries created Vach through mind, like purifying grains with a sieve, their allies recognize alliances, and there their good mark is set down in Vach. So in Vach, the goddess, but also in words. A nice parallel here, and I can send you this article because I'm always reading it and thinking about it. But there's a nice article about um, uh, Iroquois use of wampum,
Mhm.
whereas early American colonists thought of it as, oh, this is how Native Americans have money. They refine shells into beads, and they make these beautiful, and that's money. But for them, it was really a code of mnemonically encoding oaths, pacts, and things like that, even though so like the Great Law of Peace is associated with a particular image of a wampum that would help someone who is the law code keeper recall the agreements made therein. So I'll send you that article because I think it's really
Okay.
interesting. But anyway, think of it as that way. It's the good mark set down in Vach. Through the sacrifice, they come to the footprints of Vach. They found her entered in the seers, having brought her here. They distribute her out many places. 7 raspers together howl after her. These are the 7 Angirises, the sort of proto-humans that accompany Indra to Vala Cave to release the dawn and all that stuff, but also the 7 priests that would carry out a sacrifice. Some, although seeing, have not seen Vach, and some, although hearing, do not hear her. And yet for some, she spreads apart her body like a wife, dressed up and desirous for a husband. So I
Hmm.
include this despite the salaciousness, because we once again see people entering a body, and
Mhm.
a body that might be a body politic, one bound through language, allies recognizing alliances. Um, Vach is a really interesting case because she seems to be used in both in all kind. I mean, she is present at all of these rituals. Vach is in Rig Veda 10.125 called Rashtra, the female ruler, not Rajni. Rajni is a queen, the wife of a Rajan.
Hmm.
Rashtra would be a female ruler.
Hmm.
Um, and here's a passage from the Rajasuya, the ritual by which one becomes a Rajan in the Maitrayani Samhita of the Black Yajurveda. Vach is the Sarasvati, that's this river, this cosmic river. Through Vach, he sends forth truth. I am consecrated. I am become the ruler. Raja boom. His messengers establish trust for the one of good pressing. He pours the Agnihotra oblation all year for continuity. All year, meaning winter and summer, probably. So the Agnihotra is this classic daily rite he has to do every day. He milks a cow at twilight, at dawn and dusk, and pours that into a fire that is kept burning all year. Presumably, the idea is that, commentaries say you sort of milk it when the sun is setting or rising out of your Agnihotra fire. So the idea is that all the different fires of Agnihotra assemble into the sun, and then when the sun sets, they disassemble into
Hmm.
the Agnihotra fires, this model of daily fusion and fission where the house fires assemble into clan fires assemble into the fires of alliance, and all the fires of alliance presumably assemble into the sun. But it's not
Hmm.
permanent. They're constantly breaking apart, reassembling. I think that's all I want to say about this. I could get into some more stuff. Finally, Prajapati is known from like Upanishadic discourse, people that are more familiar with late Vedic stuff. What's interesting is, and there's this nice dissertation by Stephanie Meicher, where essentially you see Prajapati as this primordial sacrificer, but instead of doing anything, he has these independent faculties, vision, hearing, mind, speech, breath, and they're often leaving his body and doing various things.
Hmm.
Often they leave and say, like, which one of us is the true poem, the recitation, the uktam? Which one of us is really Brahman? And so they all leave one by one to see what causes Prajapati to die.
Hmm.
Um, And, it depends on who's telling the story, what's going to make him die. Usually I think it's breath. Um, but, you know, um, what this shows is Prajapati, in a way, is also a body politic of a society of 5 members, his faculties, who are constantly competing with one another, uh, duking it out, jousting, if you will, to see who's supreme. So even though we can think of it as a sort of like an interesting mythological story about the first sacrificer, and therefore anything we say he does has been part of the sacrifice for time immemorial, this particular framing shows a kind of vision of what's going on inside a person. A person has a compositional self. They're made of their faculties. And those faculties have some degree of independence. Well, that happens to be, I think, exactly how the agonistic coalition of the Vedic peoples worked. They thought of themselves as one body politic, but they all saw themselves also as faculties vying to be supreme within that coalition.
This, I also, I feel I'm naturally reminded of, is it in Romans or First Corinthians? Uh, who is the foot to say to the eye, you're not part of the body? Who's the eye to say to the foot, you're not, right?
Oh, yeah.
There's something about that in one of Paul's letters that reminds me very strikingly of that.
Yeah, I don't think that thinking of a physical body as a metaphor for a body politic is something particularly Vedic at all.
No.
It's all over the place. I mean, of course, we could invoke Ymir. We could also invoke the Book of the Dove.
Right, or 2,000 languages that refer to the
Yeah.
guy who's in charge as the head, right?
Yeah.
So
That's right. Exactly. So, there's nothing particularly special or precious about seeing this stuff in the Vedas. It just shows uh, a preponderance of, a kind of similarity of semantics that probably belies a similarity of understanding of social and political savvy, right? Rather than the kind of, I think, almost lobotomization we have when we live under a state and imagine that it's perpetual, and we're the disposable ones. But if you get together and make an alliance, it's the alliance that needs to, it's the old saying like, oh, you don't do anything for society, or like this person's useless, they don't do anything. But society's supposed to do stuff for us, not the other way around, right? So I think there's kind of a prescience in that, in seeing these bodies as having to be crafted. There's other places in the Rig Veda where Indra says the gods got together and made my body, and they gave me this weapon, right? So, and Indra doesn't, and this is important, Indra doesn't have kids in the Rig Veda. Right? There's no one that he's going to pass the torch on to. And he's not anxious about anybody taking over for him. He's not like, Zeus, who's like, well, the child of Metis will be so powerful, I'd better swallow her right now. And then thankfully, Athena's a woman and therefore not a candidate for the new Zeus. But Indra's not worried about that sort of thing because it's not in the nature of his position to be worried about it. He's just Indra till the next Indra, as it were. And you see this actually in later Indic religion. I probably don't have time to go into it too much, but Buddhist and Jain ascetic sodalities often call themselves sanghas, right? Which basically means a war party. And in Jain tradition, the one way of worshiping Mahavira, the founder of Jainism, is that they dress as Indras and they become the assemblage of hundreds of Indras and Indranis in all sorts of different universes and many different heavens. Indras come and go, and they transform themselves ritually into Indras to pay the ultimate kind of homage to the Mahavira. Because if the peak of the universe, Indra, is bending his knee to Mahavira, then how much greater are the Jinnas or the Tirthankars, the enlightened, Jain figures.
See the thought. And I wonder how much more we would know about this kind of seasonally organized polity too, if we had access to the literature of so many more pre-literate peoples. Because with the Vedas, we're in a really unusual position of essentially having the literature of a pre-writing society.
That's right. Yeah. What would we have had if, the knowledge of the Druids had been written down
Sure. Yeah.
and organized in such a way that we could know, oh, at this rite they do this, at this part of the ritual calendar they do this, you know.
Right.
Yeah, it would be fundamentally transformational. There's a lot of literature actually on this group of like Amazonian people called the Nambikwara. I think I'm getting that right. And what they have this kind of seasonal existence where they alternate they live in at one part of the year in almost despotism, where the big man, the head honcho politician, has absolute power, even the power to execute. But then the minute that season's over, all social relations change, and that guy's just some guy. All the power's gone. I want to say, oh, who wrote about this?
Is Cincinnatus kind of a distant memory of something like this?
I'm afraid you've exposed my ignorance about Cincinnatus. Can you tell me more?
The early king of Rome, who back when they could elect the consul to be, basically dictator for 6 months or something, and who willingly gives up that office, right?
I mean, it sounds like something that would have been infinitely reasonable, right? If you agree that political power is fraught but necessary, then you would want to put term limits on it.
Yeah, well, yeah. But I like this notion that, among people living, especially living so close to nature and its rhythms, that they let nature sort of determine what that term is, right? I mean, it's letting human life mirror the astronomical calendar.
The real weird, I mean, it's like, instead of thinking of this as people like living close to nature, I would almost say like, you don't even have to live particularly close to nature. To live at all outside of air conditioning is to notice that things change, and you don't always get to eat the things you eat all year. Like refrigeration and air conditioning is really, maybe more than the state is what has done it. Consider though, what a strange thing to have inherited monarchies, right? What does it take to produce an inherited monarchy? It takes the ability to essentially, like a perpetual monarchy takes the ability on some level to erase the year. Instead, you have to be able to produce enough food during the growing season, likely through coercion, that there's no abating of eating throughout the rest of the year. You have a big enough surplus that you can kind of erase the fact that if we had organized our resource management in different ways, we would have to fundamentally change our nature of our subsistence. Right?
Yeah.
You could be agriculturalists and grow food for a season. Then you could switch to foraging for acorns, right? A great long-term storage solution. Could be a nice fishing season. You smoke your fish, right? But if you have found a way to produce enough surplus of wheat flour that you can just eat wheat and beer all year long, you kind of erase the fact that probably for most of human existence, we didn't live that way.
Right.
I think instead of a Neolithic revolution where agriculture just like booms and changes everything, I think probably people experimented with agriculture just on temporary basis, because who wants to farm when you could like hunt? I mean, frankly, and if that's not an option, then you can maybe farm or you could forage. Personally, I like shellfish. I don't want to farm. I would much rather look for shellfish and pull it off the rocks as my full-time day. And I'm a big fan of anchovies. I could eat anchovies if I had to pick one pizza for the rest of my life: anchovy and pineapple, no cheese. It's weird, but you know what? You never have to share. But
yeah, agriculture goes from being part of a portfolio of resource acquisition to being something imposed upon you to maintain the year-round resources of a state. Yeah, I see what you mean about that actually being a bigger revolution in human lifestyle than just, oh yeah, we planted these particular plants. Yeah.
You can tell a big difference if you compare, I think, like Incan political power and Mesopotamian political power. Mesopotamian political power, little city states, they have walls. It's very difficult to run away if you don't really want to farm. And when the wheat is yay high, everyone can see it. They know exactly how much you produce and how much tax you owe. Look at Andean civilization. There, the main crop would be potatoes. And you can't really see the potatoes. They're underground. There you can see the tomatoes, also good. But what we see in the Incan civilization is something called vertical archipelagos. That is, one level of the mountain is going to be really good for making potatoes or tomatoes or growing the plant that would be used to make cotton. Or if you're low enough, you can fish for those delicious sardines and anchovies. And so the way that the Incans ruled was with almost no boots on the ground. They instead created strategic deficiencies between these levels so that they, as the organizers of motion between those levels by building roads for the llamas and this and that, and building the posts and trading posts, they were able essentially to keep their empire organized, not through like Roman style hard power, but through American style soft power, by creating these incentives that outweighed any kind of rebellion. Because what are you going to do? You rebel, and you're like, we only make cotton here, and I really want those anchovies. So, I think there were just particular things about wheat that made monarchical city-state kingship really be able to take off in one particular place that happened to be connected to the rest of Eurasia and the Nile and Africa, right? Where they also the big bread belt, as it were, or bread basket. And I think it comes late to other places.
Even, well, I suppose rice is a similar thing in Eastern Asia. But yeah, I suppose even in Northern Europe and potentially even in India, these things are coming a little bit later.
Well, and rice farming takes a little bit of time to penetrate into India, right? The main Indus Valley civilization crops, I think, are like wheat, millet, sorghum. It's a while before rice paddies appear.
Okay.
And the best, most arable land there was not really easy to. I mean, the best land for that sort of thing was Gangetic Basin land, but that was full of these dense jungles you couldn't chop down. You couldn't chop down until the Iron Revolution. But then the problem was most sources of iron were really far away from the Ganges. And so you need a crazy series of events where an urban civilization arises that's able to, one, produce more than enough food to keep a population of specialists who are going to be making iron and bronze, but also transporting iron and bronze to new areas to cut down trees and create new arable areas for growing crops. And they're able to suppress the formation of other cities. Because if another city crops up, then it's going to be in the same situation, and you're going to be competing for the same like grain base to support those specialists. So honestly, I think it's still kind of many of the facts of the urbanization of the Gangetic Plain are still mysterious to me. I think some suggestions that have been made that are pretty interesting is that starting from Indus Valley and earlier, there seems to be an institution of the granary, right? That if we store up enough food for disaster, but then if those disasters don't come, you end up with this tradition of always having a surplus that could feed specialists. Perhaps what was related to this is that the population surplus led to the creation of the ascetic orders, monastic orders, which also worked like granaries and banks. They collected resources. They had to be supported, but at the same time, were able to lend out all this food. This is something, of course, that the British destroyed during the British East India Company. They saw granaries and they would sell all the rice or whatever in Bengal, and then they would anticipate a shortage. And so they would buy up all the rice, and then there would be a shortage and they would sell it. And by playing with these prices and not using granaries, they made tremendous profits, but like millions and millions of people died of famine. Whereas under the Mughals, that tradition of maintaining step wells, maintaining granaries, maintaining reservoirs was unbroken from Ashokan times and maybe even earlier. And so, there was always kind of a buffer from disaster. And that's what allowed these urban populations, I think, to really flourish. When Megasthenes went to modern day Patna, Pataliputra, the capital of Chandragupta Maurya, he was like, this place is like 10 Athenses glued together. It was enormous. It basically went it was between two rivers, and it basically went to the walls to the banks of each. It was an urban sprawl without compare, is essentially how he sort of describes it. So I can't remember what I was talking about.
Well, but that's
I lost track.
talking about the organization of early urban India and what you've shed light on for
Yeah.
the past 2 hours, and we should probably tend toward an ending at this point, is the organization of Vedic Indic speaking peoples. And I think you've shed a lot of fascinating light on that. I see a hand raised by Nate. If Nate, if you have a question, you're welcome to put it in the chat, or you're on audio. Okay.
If you don't mind. So fascinating, mind-blowingly cool stuff. So thank you very much. I know I felt like I recognized a lot of similarities and resonances and echoes to other later Indo-European cultures. Feasts and obligations and gift giving and all of that. Is there a direct continuity between them, or do you think it's a case of there's a certain amount of independent parallel social growth? And relatedly, do we have any idea what might be an intermediary point, like what, I don't know, the Hallstatt culture did in this respect? Is that I don't know if that's a good question.
No, that's a good question. I'm not sure if I have a good answer. I think that in the case of the Vedas, we have so much rich poetic material rife with this kind of symbolism that we can really I'm not particularly good at interpreting archaeological remains. I've been reading, God, when did I learn Sanskrit? 2005. So, it's basically taken me almost 20 years to come to these conclusions, just thinking about the same set of poems again and again and again. I'm not sure if that's a good use of time, but it kind of shows the degree of focus on one particular set of materials that it takes. And so I'm not particularly good at jumping about in a very serious way. And the question of continuity versus parallel development is, of course, always an interesting one. But I think, I guess me personally, I'm always a little suspicious of continuity stuff. Language continuity makes 100% sense to me. Cultural echoes in the form of transmitted poetic capacities makes perfect sense to me. The use of technology as transmitted through continuity makes perfect sense to me. When we talk about political relations, especially when I think we're talking about really creative relationships, really inspiring degrees of political intelligence, to see the possibilities of compact, to exploit them, and to abandon them when necessary. When I see when I look back at the past, I see some really incredibly savvy politicians, smart leadership operators. They're not going to cart me around to various corporations to talk about Indra as ideal CEO or whatever. But to me, we don't necessarily need to talk about an Indo-European tradition of political intelligence. I think that's something that can awaken in humans all the time and has to really be actively suppressed, right? We talk about the invention of democracy in ancient Greece or whatever. I think democracy is kind of natural. I think everybody that feels like things ought to be a certain way for themselves understands that they need to persuade others to do it. And hopefully that collectively we can come to something. We don't need to invent democracy in a sense. It's the opposite, that there's strictures of power that transcend the choice that put us in subject positions and transcend our choice. That is what we have to be convinced of and forced upon us in a sense. It's coming across as very anarcho-optimistic, and maybe it is, but I guess what I'm saying is I don't think when we're talking about participatory government in Indo-European societies, on the one hand, I don't think we need to look for an origin for it. I think the origin is right here. People want what's best for themselves, and they understand, and they were politically intelligent, and they understood relationships and how to work them. When it comes to the use of hospitality rights, specifically in that capacity and their particular developments, I think that we can trace specifically to the steppe cultures because they existed at a great distance from one another and they had anxieties about each other. Even someone who's just a few rivers down, it's been a while since we hung out, and I kind of might have insulted them a feast ago, right? So the idea that there were ritual protocols to make sure we're copacetic before we know that we really are, that's, I think, might be a steppe thing. And therefore we could trace its inheritance into ritual formalisms of hospitality rites into other Indo-European branches. But I stress that I don't think we necessarily need to look for an origin for people choosing their leadership and negotiating what we might think of as virtuous hierarchies. We're conditioned with liberal subjecthood to think that no hierarchy could be virtuous. That's fascism. But I think, and in many cases, there are vicious hierarchies that are fascistic. I'm not trying to be pro-fascism, but I do think that if we look at the broad swath of human data, not just Indo-European data, but human data now, today, in the past, in the ancient past, we do see a preponderance of people looking for virtuous hierarchies to fit into, even when they're not on the top. You think of the Iliad. There's some guy who is free, but he has no friends and he's isolated. And in that sense, he's worse than a slave because at least a retainer has a master and there's security in that. Now, I'm not saying that it's better to be a slave, but to them, it seemed like that's what they were claiming. Better to be someone with a lot of relationships, strong, steady, reliable relationships, than someone who's completely alone. I'm not sure if that answered the question at all.
Fantastic. Thank you.
I think it's a fantastic thought.
Insight.
And this conversation has been full of insights. We've taken a lot of your time. I think we should close it here. And if anyone has further questions for Dr. Smith, let me know. I'll pass them on. Caley, we should do this again.
It was fun. Yeah.
And I hope that
it's good seeing you, Jackson.
Yeah, it's been too long.
You're looking very distinguished. I've been hoping that some white might come in. I'm not sure exactly what pattern, but maybe some fangs I think would be cool. Good. I think I'm just gonna go straight to white overnight. And right now you can't see it because it's in the blonde. Oh, I'm blonde, by the way. This is black and white, but I'm blonde. I was gonna say black and white. So. Black and white, but yeah. No, long have I desired the distinguished laurels of a salt and pepper beard.
Yeah, so, you like the senator look or whatever. Well,
yeah, it favors you.
Oh, thank you. All right. I just do it because Lauren likes it. All right.
Well, that's why we do everything, right?
100%.
All right. Well, thank you for having me on your show.
Always welcome on the show. Really.
All I had to do was ask.
All right. Well, you will be asked again shortly.
I need to think of something else. I think I've run out of interesting things to say, but
I doubt that. Well, but hope to see you again soon. Merci beaucoup. All the best to you.